All right, so today's topics this week, we actually have two topics. So I am going to have to post two lectures, but I'm actually going to try to make these a little bit shorter and succinct because you could pause the video anytime if you want to read through the actual slide. I do want to, respect time management, and for things that maybe I feel need to be elaborated on a bit more, along with this video, I'm also going to post some of the short Khan Academy videos. So please sign up for Khan Academy. I posted the codes on Google Classroom. So every class period has its own code. You'll see that on the Google stream. And then I also have the codes posted on my teacher site under AP World. So you've got two places you can look for those codes. Also, if you currently have a Khan Academy account for another teacher, you don't have to create a new account. Just log into your current account and you just enter the class code. I think there's like a plus sign at the top of the page, join class, join coach. They have their own terminology, and just enter my class code. All right, so, and luckily also I could probably zip through this one a little bit faster because you did so much work today already looking at the Byzantine Empire and that hyperslide activity. So what we're looking at essentially is Eastern Europe. And so our focus this week is Christian societies in Europe. So we split it up in two, basically because the two split after the fall of the Roman Empire. So post-Roman Empire. So if you need to, you could go back and look at the lecture and some of the videos I posted from the classical period Rome. But just to kind of summarize, as the Roman Empire got so massive and you had competing generals that were basically elected consuls of the Senate, were power hungry, and they were usually scheming under the emperor. Then you had a series of weak emperors, and you had basically like the Diocletian period where the empire was like temporarily split into four, and then they split it into two, and the whole idea was that it wasn't like an official split, it was just trying to break the empire up kind of thing in districts to make it easier to manage. But essentially what happened is, with Constantine, you have the split in two. He moves the capital from Rome to what he names Constantinople, that's present-day Istanbul. And so, Rome falls. The Western Empire falls due to, barbarian invasions and internal issues such as tax issues and land disparities. But the Byzantine, the eastern side, goes on to prosper. And so this is pretty much where the post-classical period establishes itself. Also to remind you, Constantine, was a polytheistic Roman politician, and then he had to go into battle, and he had the vision that if you put the Christ symbol on the shields, he would win the battle. He won the battle, and that's when he made Christianity, he created religious tolerance for Christianity because he converted himself, and then later Christianity is going to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. So we're really going to see Christianity spread during the post-classical period, since essentially came about kind of late in period two. So the two Christian civilizations that develop out of the splitting of the Roman empires be Eastern Orthodoxy Christianity. It's oftentimes referred to Greek Orthodoxy, and then other areas that also adopt it. Say, for example, as I mentioned in class today, Kiev Rus will adopt it, and that eventually becomes Russia. So Russian Orthodoxy. And then you have Western Christianity, which is essentially the Catholic Church. And they're going to split. They are going to develop some slightly different ideological differences. But Greek Orthodoxy and Catholicism are going to spread north. They don't spread south, because basically you have, if you were to come south, you have the Arabian Peninsula, and the Muslim caliphates have already spread across northern Africa and the Middle East. They don't spread east because, you will have some Christian missionaries that get into China and so forth, but you're not ever going to see a really high conversion rate that direction. So essentially Christianity has north to spread, and that's the direction it will go. Catholicism cannot spread any further west than Western Europe at this time because the Atlantic Ocean is a geographical barrier. Religious missionaries for both West and Eastern are unable to convert one another. So what that means is that Western and Eastern Christianity, or Catholicism versus the Eastern Orthodox Church, are never going to really come to a consensus, and so they'll remain permanently split. Religions are culturally and then later even organizationally separate, and this is known as the schism in Christianity. So that's one of your vocab terms today. So you have the map there kind of reminding you of where things kind of left off with the Roman Empire. So the Byzantine Empire, at its height, the Byzantine Empire will expand out of the Anatolia Peninsula, so that is a geographical term, and it's going to consist of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and parts of the Middle East. And their goal is, initially they did want to recapture the glory of Rome. They'll even try to fight some battles and recapture that territory, but essentially that will not happen. So after the fall of Western Rome, period 2, the Eastern Empire is going to thrive for another 1,000 years. And so this is where the East and the West kind of go on two very different paths. Western Europe, and I'll talk about it later this week, we try not to use the term Dark Ages, but traditionally a lot of historians used to refer to Western Europe during this time as the Dark Ages, while as the Byzantine Empire is thriving. Emperor Constantine of the Roman Empire, so this kind of goes back to the review I gave you, built the Byzantium, or Constantinople. Constantinople is the new capital in the Anatolia Peninsula, so this is present-day Istanbul of Turkey, and the emperors are going to inherit the Roman line of authority. So they do try to continue Roman law code and culture. By 476 Common Era, the western half of the empire completely collapses, and that is the permanent division between the West and East. Western and Eastern Europe, and we still refer to Western and Eastern Europe to this day based on this line, this division. And they are going to develop differently and culturally and politically, and even to this day there's a lot of differences between Western and Eastern Europe. In the East, Constantinople is the capital. It was an extremely cosmopolitan, opulent, wealthy city. So this would be one of our major cities of the post-classical period. They were involved in Mediterranean and Central Asian commerce and trade, and in fact, because of their geographic location, they're going to be a perfect crossroad of goods between Central Asia and China, Indian Ocean trade through going into Western Europe. They become an economic powerhouse and the trade center visited by peoples from all over the world. So it's going to be kind of a multicultural center as well as different merchants come to this site. So the Greek Eastern Orthodox Christianity, they retain their strength despite the rapid growth of Islam. The spread culture and politics to parts of the world that had not been controlled by any major civilization before, so the Balkans of Eastern Europe and Western Russia. Russia was not yet centralized. They will survive until 1453 when Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks, who renamed the city Istanbul, and they establish a Muslim caliphate there. So essentially, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But essentially you have, Eastern Europe being developed through Constantinople. So with these quick review questions, I know I kind of scrolled through them, but this would be a good time for you guys to stop, pause, and maybe think about the answers. Edpuzzle, something I'm going to probably start playing with soon where I can do that as well. So the Byzantine emperors. Emperors often intervene in theological disputes. And so this is where in the Eastern Orthodox Church you're going to see in these civilizations there's a very close relationship between the head of the church and politics. Very similar to what we just saw last week with Islam. So they're going to use their political position to define what is orthodox. That means they're using their political position to decide what is the religious standard of practice. And orthodoxy means, strict rule. So they're going to establish, the beliefs and customs. That also means they decide what is false, heretical, or dangerous. And so the key vocab term for the Byzantine Empire is Caesaropapism, and that really is Caesar plus Pope. And so this shows you that close relationship between the political and religious leader. The policy of political and religious power concentrated all in the emperor's hands. And so one of the things I really want you guys to look at, there's a few images here, there's images in Hyperdoc, but you'll see like Emperor Justinian especially, oftentimes, there's like this round circular halo shape around his image, and so again that's artwork being used to convey this message of divine power. So the emperor stood above the law of the land, hence there's a very close relationship between church and government. And so you can see right here in these images you got that halo right there, and there as well. And you even have this very much Virgin Mary kind of image here where this looks very much like Jesus here. So the Byzantine artwork demonstrated here, so this shows Caesaropapism demonstrated through artwork, and that's one of the things they look for in the AP exam is, can you look at artwork and decide, what message is meant to be sent to the subjects through this. And so here the Virgin Mary is amid the emperors Justinian and Constantine, and they observe they all have the halo around their head, their work. So around their head. So artwork was basically used to justify or legitimize rule. So So Justinian is our most well-known and famous, and definitely help you out on an AP essay leader to look at. So Justinian reigns from 527 to 565. He is the most significant Byzantine emperor. Under his rule, the military gains and basically conducts huge expansion to rebuild the original Roman Empire. They will be successful in gaining back some North African territory and some of Italy, but for the most part, they never reconquer all the territory that Rome once was. He's most famous for Justinian Code, and this is the codification of Roman law, and I know you guys looked at this in your hyperdoc, but essentially it's because of the Byzantines. They preserved, it was in the 12 tables, Roman law code, and through that preservation, they used the laws, but it also preserved it, that enabled Roman law to continue to influence civilizations down the road over the long term. So it served as a basis for civil law codes that developed later throughout much of Western Europe. And that's important. It's a good tool to use as a leader because it reduces legal confusion, and it also is a unifying force within the Byzantine Empire. Projects to renovate Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, and I need to look it up. I don't know if it's a hard G or soft G, or Hagia Sophia, but this is considered an engineering and architectural achievement. Very complex architecture with a dome. It translates to the Church of Holy Wisdom. So this is going to be the most notable Christian church in Eastern Europe. So it's one of the most notable examples of architecture sponsored by Justinian. And he's also going to use language as a way to create unity within his empire. He's going to make Greek the official language. More people spoke Greek than Latin, and so Latin's going to go on to become associated with Western Europe and the Catholic Church, whereas Greek is going to become more associated with the Eastern Orthodoxy Church and Eastern Europe. And so, this is going to, enable, religious doctrines and so forth to be more accessible to citizens within the empire. The West, they will view the West as inferior and barbaric, especially as Western Europe is crumbling. And we'll see later this week that Western Europe really was a lot of very tribal still, and then it's going to eventually lead to regional kingdoms, but a lot of warring tribe-like behavior with in that area. So Greek allows them to also read the classical text from the classical period of Greece. And so again, they're also going to preserve a lot of that Greek, Roman philosophy, knowledge, math, and sciences that is really just going to kind of fall out in decline in the West. And then Empress Theodora is an exceptional woman during this time period. The Byzantines were actually very restrictive of women. This was a very strong patriarchy. In fact, the Byzantine Empire is they are going to expect women to wear the headscarves and cover their faces, and they expect women to stay mostly indoors and stay out of the public eye. And that's actually something that Islam is going to have contact with the Byzantine Empire and adopt from them. But Empress Theodora exerted great influence over Emperor Justinian, who often took her advice. So she was able to exercise political influence through her husband. And there will be other empresses that help co-rule as well, but just keep in mind the typical woman definitely did not have that much power and influence, and it was a very strong patriarchy. So the Byzantine Empire under the height of Justinian rule, so again, you can always pause this later and look at it, but I suggest you take some time to look at the map. Here's some pictures of the church. So I think this picture here, you can really see for that time period what an architectural masterpiece it was. And then you look inside, and you can still visit it today. When the Ottoman Turks take over in the mid-1400s, they convert it to a Muslim mosque, but it's still, obviously standing today. So Muslim pressure and Byzantine defense. So we saw last week that the Abbasid Caliphate was very ambitious in territorial expansion, and these two civilizations will come in contact with one another. So after Justinian, Byzantine rulers' primary concern was defending themselves against Muslim invaders. They were able to hold off Muslims in general, but they lost some of their regained territories in the Mediterranean. The Muslim naval fleet was extremely skilled, so the Byzantine Empire is going to have to try to play catch up and develop a navy themselves. In 711, the Byzantines famously drive back Muslims when they use Greek fire. It was basically combustible liquid that when you mix petroleum, quicklime, and sulfur, and you swish it on the water, lights a fire. I'm not a chemistry person. I'm sure there's a more eloquent way of explaining that, but they are going to able to devastate air fleets in that battle using that Greek fire method. So there you got some very ancient artwork portraying the use of Greek fire. You got the Byzantines here against the Muslim fleet. But over time, the Byzantine Empire, their size and strength is going to be reduced. They will eventually lose more and more territory to Muslim conflicts, and then eventually coming out of Central Asia, the Ottoman Turks come in and invade and take over in the mid-1400s. They're also going to have interior problems, so it's not always just the exterior, there's interior problems. They're going to tax very highly. In fact, they're going to tax so highly that Eastern Orthodox Christians that are citizens of the Byzantine Empire are actually going to welcome Arab invaders because the Arab caliphates had a more fair tax system. So they increased taxes to try to increase the wealth for the upper classes, but obviously peasants and merchants below them are going to feel the impact of that. They're going to start to have a lineage of weak emperors. So that means large land-owning, wealthy men are going to be able to grow more powerful, and that means they're going to challenge those weak emperors. So over time, you're going to have a weakening empire. So Byzantine politics, rulers saw themselves as Roman emperors and as ordained by God. So the government was seen as a continuation of the previous Roman Empire from the classical period. Emperors were head of the government church. They had a very complex bureaucracy. It was open to all classes, but the aristocrats, that traditional land-owning base of wealth that I talked about in class today, is going to mostly dominate the government. The bureaucracy helped to organize the empire politically, socially, and economically. They're able to train in Greek classics and science, so they did appreciate that knowledge and rational and logical thinking. They're going to appoint governors. They're also going to use a spy system to create loyalty. So we talked about some governments in the last unit that did that. Troops will be recruited locally and given land for services. And hereditary military leaders gain too much power over time. So while troops are recruited, those higher, I think like officer positions, are going to be based on family lineage. And again, just like aristocratic landowners, they're going to start to assert themselves for power. Byzantine culture, creativity in architecture, so that dome-style building is going to be very common. They're going to be known for their very richly colored mosaics, so that is a distinctive Byzantine artistic style. So if you look closely at this, all those little squares and shapes, that's because it's tiled, so it's mosaic. So it's very flat, frontal, formal. So if you can see here, it's basically very two-dimensional. This obviously doesn't look realistic. It doesn't have depth like a photograph. Icon painting, so such as painting of saints and religious figures, and you will have some leaders down the road that tried to ban icon paintings. Cultural life blended Hellenism, so Greek culture, and Orthodox Christianity. They are trade goods with silk production learned from China. So they had to sneak in and steal the secrets of China on how to produce silk. So this means they could produce their own silk, make their own profits. They didn't have to rely on foreign trade as much. And then the state organized school system, so kind of along the lines of public education. They put an emphasis on the Greek classics. They factored into replacing Latin with Greek as the language of the official documents. And then they developed their own written alphabet, the Cyrillic writing system. So this is different than the Roman alphabet we use here, so I inserted this image just to kind of show you some of the letters are the same, some of them are different. So the Cyrillic alphabet is still used in many Eastern European nations today, Russia included. So Byzantine society, the empire is centrally controlled by the bureaucracy in Constantinople, so that will always remain the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, as opposed to like what we saw last week with Islam. The capital moved around a bit from Damascus to Baghdad, but they're going to have a large peasant class, so even though their empire is not as large as what Rome once was, just keep in mind large empires always require a lot of food, so there's always a large peasant class that's creating that agricultural surplus. Constantinople was a large trade center due to its geographic location, so you looked at maps a lot today. So they were basically in the center of everything. They connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, so this was, very fruitful for the merchant class, artisans, and craftsmen. Women had less rights than women in the Roman Empire. As I mentioned earlier, very restrictive for the common female. Confined to home life, often concealed their faces when they left home. They could only socialize with men from their families, so usually their husband, or if they're younger, their fathers and their brothers. So the Great Schism mentioned earlier, this just kind of breaks down some of the religious differences between the two sides of Christianity at this time. So when we look later this week at Western Europe, the Catholic Church is going to have a lot of power over the state. So religion over the state, but here it was state over religion because basically the state merged the religious hierarchy into the government. Clerical celibacy, so that means whether or not church leaders are allowed to engage in relations. So in the Roman Catholic Church, clerical celibacy, I believe this is backwards. Oh my goodness. But yeah, the Roman Catholic Church did not condone male and female relations, but that's something that does come along later. And there's a lot of historical research into this, like where did it come up that popes were not supposed to engage in sex or any other leadership, and some of it comes down to property right laws, and there were issues of popes having illegitimate children, and so the concern was that if they grew up they'd be able to claim church lands. The Eucharist, that's part of Christian practice, so it's different types of breads they use. Their official language, so the Catholic Church is Latin, whereas the the Eastern Orthodox Church is Greek, so it made it more accessible to the average person, whereas most people in Western Europe do not speak Latin. And again, that's going to create a power hold for the Catholic Church, because if they claim that they have all religious authority and they have this Bible that no one else can read, it's easy for them to claim that, and that's going to lead to one of the things that leads to the Protestant Reformation later on, is that people want to be able to read the Bible directly for themselves. And then their law codes are influenced by Roman law versus Greek philosophy. So separate paths emerged over disagreements well before the official split. Christian practice was so widely spread across Europe that differences naturally emerged as it blended with local traditions. And in fact, I am going to post a little quick Khan Academy video where the Nicene Council, where essentially leadership in the church had to sit down and kind of make official, this is where we stand. Is Jesus divine? Is he not divine? And so they kind of had to get it straight, what did it mean to be a Christian and what are our rules and expectations. So basically both sides mutually excommunicate with one another, so this is seen as the official split in 1054, so they're never able to come to a consensus. So you have the two different traditions that emerge. So leading to Byzantine decline, they start to decline after 1054. 1071, the Battle of Manzikert. This is when the Seljuk Turks take most of Central Asian provinces, and that means they're going to start to remove important sources of tax, food, and trade for the Byzantines. So when you start to cut into a empire's economy, that's going to start to lead to their decline as well. Independent Slavic states will start to emerge and challenge Byzantine authorities such as Bulgaria and Serbia, and they will officially break away from Byzantine control. By 1204, this is going to lead into the Crusades, and in fact, the Byzantines are really the ones that, going back to the first Crusades, they're going to, send a letter to the Pope Urban II, and they're essentially going to ask for help or protection against the Muslim raiders, and this essentially is what invites Western Europe back into Eastern Europe, and you start to have the Crusades, where Christian societies are fighting against Muslims to reclaim the Holy Lands. That was basically the agenda, the goal of the early Crusades, but later on it's become much more economic. In fact, by the Fourth Crusade, Venetian merchants, so a city-state of Italy, these merchant families will be so powerful, and they're going to want to challenge what's left of Byzantine as a trade center, and in fact, they're going to be the ones that are going to hire armies to attack Constantinople, so that's really Christians fighting Christians. So Venetians and other Italian states, like I said, were becoming prominent rivals of the Byzantine Empire. And by 1453, what's left of the Byzantine Empire is so weak it will be taken over by the Ottoman Turks. So you have a map here you can kind of look at, the eventually breakdown. So now what we're going to look at, this is kind of getting out of Byzantine and looking at, okay, well, how does that culture spread, and what eventually leads to what will become Russia eventually. So Eastern Europe is influenced by Byzantine conquest, Christian missionaries, and conversion efforts and trade routes. And so Byzantines will go north and trade north. By the 9th century, Byzantine Christian missionaries Cyril and Methodius are going to help bring orthodoxy northward into Russia and the Balkans. They're the ones that actually created that Cyrillic alphabet, and they're going to also start to teach people to read and spread literacy in Greek, and so that also is going to help create a power base for the Byzantine Empire. So looking at who basically resided in Eastern Europe beyond the Byzantine Empire, so there was competition between Catholics and Orthodox Greeks for converts. So as I mentioned in class today, Christianity is a proselytizing religion, which means missionaries is a component of that belief system and winning over converts. Catholic converts are going to mostly be in Hungary and Poland. Monarchies with powerful land-owning aristocrats will start to develop. And you also have an influx of Jews into Western Russia and Eastern Europe during this time period because they're trying to escape persecution as well. So you have a lot of migrations of peoples occurring during this time period. They're going to migrate into a region in large numbers, what is now known as Poland. Jewish communities place a high value upon education and literacy for males. The Jewish communities had limited professions available, so they will be persecuted against even these new areas. They'll even be barred from owning land and creating an agricultural base, and they're going to be resented by the Christian community. And this is essentially why I hate to bring up stereotypes, but there's always a stereotype about Jewish people and money management. Well, if you could look right here, they were barred from most professions. They're barred from owning land. They had to find a way to make a living, and so they're going to start to get into the service sector, essentially, money management, and so that's where some of those stereotypes coming from. So the emergence of Kiev Rus. So who are the Russians? So groups from Asia are going to move into the region during the Roman Empire, and in fact, teaching this class last year actually inspired me to take one of those DNA tests because as you know, Kanonchuk, I am of Russian descent, and I was kind of curious how far back it would trace my bloodline, and I wanted to see if I had any Mongolian bloodline or anything Central Asian, and it just said Russian, so who knows. But Russia really is kind of a melting pot of different peoples. It's you look at a map, it's territorially it's massive. So groups from Asia are going to move into the region during the Roman Empire. It's going to be mostly an agricultural society. There'll be ironwork. People are living in, they're very tribal, living in villages. Polytheistic, animistic kind of religion, where you have gods of sun, thunder, wind, fire, and believing in spirits and objects and so forth. So we've seen that in a few other civilizations. But Kiev will be a city that starts to become a major trade center. It basically was a connecting point from the Scandinavian Vikings, we'll talk about Vikings more later this week, and the Byzantine Empire. So it was a conduit of trade between Byzantines and Scandinavia. And so luxury products came through there, such as silk roads. Luxury products from the Silk Roads came through there. So this city is going to start to grow. By 855, Kiev becomes a kingdom under a Danish merchant, Rurik, and he's going to be known as the first prince of Kiev Rus. But as I mentioned in class earlier today, there wasn't a common religion. In fact, he was Danish. That means he was a Viking leader. The Vikings were pretty much like the Danes, the Swedish, the Norwegians, and so you have these people starting to be ruled under a prince, and so that little glowing area kind of shows you where Kiev Rus kind of expanded. And to give you perspective, when I was talking about the Vikings, you've got Sweden and Norway, and then Denmark, and so that's where the Vikings essentially came from. And so they would come down on their longboats to the river systems, and then you've got like Byzantine and all that coming up here, so they were the crossroads. So here's a better map for those trade routes. And so right here is that Anatolian peninsula that we're talking about, where the Byzantine Empire was. So politics and religion in Kiev and Rus. So Vladimir the First, What religion to choose? So he is after Rurik, and he recognizes he wants to unify his people. So I know I talked about this in class today. He wants to move away from animism, and he understands that if he were to unify his people under a state-mandated faith, that would have a unifying effect. So in 1000, he converts to Orthodoxy on behalf of all of his people, and he organizes mass baptisms and basically forced conversions with military pressure. Why Christian Orthodox? Judaism was not associated with any major empire, so it was not politically strategic. It would not help enhance any kind of trade relations with other peoples. The RCC, the Roman Catholic Church, he did not want to have to answer to the Pope. As I said, in Islam, he couldn't drink alcohol, and he had already started to develop a trade relationship with the Byzantine Empire, so it just seemed like the natural selection. Just like in the Byzantine Empire, he is going to create a close relationship between being not only the ruler of the state, but being the ruler of the Eastern Orthodox Church within Kiev Rus. So he controls the church and creates a literate Russian priesthood. Vladimir wanted to rise to the same status as the Byzantine Empire. Following Vladimir, you have Yaroslav. He develops and issues unifying formal law code. So again, they're kind of mimicking that Roman law code tradition that the Byzantines maintained. They used arranged marriages to create a system of royalty within Kiev Rus. They're going to translate religious literature from Greek to Slavic, since Russians do not speak Greek language. They spoke Slavic languages. So again, that unifying effect of actually translating the Bible into a language people read as opposed to Latin. The translation makes the text accessible to the people. So again, that's going to have that unifying effect. Culture in Kiev and Rus, it's going to be very similar to Byzantium. The Kiev Rus were very attracted to the ceremony and the luxury of Byzantine royalty. So this is going to eventually turn into Russian culture, but if you were to ever visit Russia, I haven't been lucky enough to do so, but they have a lot of elaborate, very colorful, gorgeous architecture and artwork where you kind of see that mosaic and the minarets and the pillars and the domes and all that kind of influence. They're going to have a very peaceful trade relationship with the Byzantine Empire. So the Greek Orthodox are going to influence the Russian Orthodox Church. So while they have their own names, they're pretty similar. So very ornate churches, that means very decorative. Monasticism will develop. This means essentially monks, and they're going to have that ascetic lifestyle, ascetic. So that means when they give up their worldly comfort goods to live a pious life. So this will be a very fervent religious devotion, no interest in science and math, nothing secular. So that's going to be a little different than you saw with the Byzantines maintaining Greek philosophies there. Art, icons, illuminated manuscripts, literature, they're going to use the Cyrillic alphabet. Peasants were free farmers, and aristocratic landlords were called boyars in Russia. So we're going to refer to those aristocrats as boyars when we start talking about Russia more. Had less political power than similar Westerners. So basically, feudalism is going to develop in Kiev Rus and what eventually becomes Russia, but it's going to look a little different than the feudalism we're going to see in Western Europe later this week. Kievan decline. So they don't officially become Russia quite yet. They essentially will be taken over by the Mongols, so the Central Asian invaders. It's not going to be really after the Mongol decline that Russia as we know it today is going to be established, but you can read that slide a little bit more. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire is going to decline, and that's going to reduce Russian trade and wealth, since Russia's, or Kiev Rus I should really say, their close relationship with the Byzantine Empire really had that trade network. Orthodox Christianity and Russian culture are going to remain despite their decline in trade influence. So keep in mind that's our common theme, is that governments might rise and fall, but now there's that religious glue that kind of unifies people together. So it's very similar to Hinduism and the caste system. Despite the empire, the Gupta and the Mauryan empires fallen apart in India, people are still held together by the Hindu caste system. So a major period 3 theme here is that religion is going to supersede political identity. And there you go. So that is today's lecture.